Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. In India, a shocking gang rape on a bus shows the underside of the country's economic miracle. In China, uncertainty following a very rare leadership transition raises huge questions about the country's future. And in Africa, economies seem to be increasingly vulnerable to the price of raw materials. It's been a bumpy start to 2013 for emerging nations in the world. But don't write them off, says my guest for today. Jean-Joseph Boyau is a French economist, a prolific commentator in the French media, and he's the author of Chine d'Afrique. The book has just been published this month, and the subheading is China, India, and Africa will shape tomorrow's world. Welcome to you to the show, Jean-Joseph. You write that there's a particularly French kind of skepticism about the rise of China, India, and Africa. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, it's easy to understand. If you look at the news in France, most of the time they just are looking at the half-empty glass or at the bad or the black side of the news. They never have the positive aspect of the news. Just to take the example you mentioned in India, this terrible gang rape and murder actually is a very good sign because the civil society has started to fight against corruption, the way the police is not at all protecting the girl, etc. So we have not mentioned that. The young Indian society is moving very fast. This is good news. Look at China. What the bad news is about Xi Jinping, the new leader. Well, uncertainty, etc. But my God, I started to work on China in early 1980s. At that time, I could see, the way the young Chinese wanted to change. We always mention the bad news. As for Africa, my God, look, during the Happy New Year pause, we mentioned about Central Africa or Mali. Okay, they are terrible situation, but 4 million inhabitants in South Africa, 11 million inhabitants in Mali. But now look at Ethiopia or even Nigeria. Their economic growth is about 7, 8, 9, 10% a year. No news, good news, we say usually in France. But we are only talking about the bad news. So the people in France do not have the information to understand that the world is moving very fast.
How is it moving, though, towards what you describe in your book as this triangle between China, India, and Africa? I mean, is Europe basically, sleepwalking into a new century that is going to be dominated by these three blocks?
Yeah, it's a very good question. There is a fear that because of these huge giants coming up, and look at China, but India and Africa now are growing very fast, there is a sense of decline.
Decline.
Okay, let decline. No, it's stupid. We have billions of people coming up with their energy, their market. It should be a very good news indeed. And Europeans have really the technology, the genius during the Industrial Revolution to take up the challenge. But they are scared by these giants.
So despite the lack of news about countries that are important, you mentioned some of the more populous countries in Africa which are not being covered by the media. Despite that, you're saying basically that European elites, they do know about the up-and-coming countries, but they're somehow afraid of that.
Well, the question is not Europe, because if you look at the crisis in Europe, this is a good reflection of there are some Europeans who are very successfully taking up the challenge. The German, the Nordic countries. They have targeted the countries like China or India or even Africa with great success. And you have some other Europeans who are not able to challenge China. And I think the crisis in Europe is a crisis of the vision of the future. You have some Europeans who really understand what are the challenges, and some others who are very frileux. And I think this is why Europe is divided.
Very reticent. You write a lot about cultural power and how Europe, or let's say some European countries, could do a lot more to sell themselves in soft ways. Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, what is, the cultural battle over, films in China and Africa, and how Europe is positioning itself?
Yeah, I was surprised. And I'm always surprised when traveling in these countries, China, India, or even Africa, to see how Europe is fascinating for them. First of all, the values of democracy, etc., are from Europe, and they do consider that really Europe is the land of the wonderful revolution. Number two, what kind of movie do you see? Okay, the American movies. The Hollywood industry is very strong, but also the European movies, the European singers. And I was always surprised to see how the Europeans are not aware of their strong influence in the world. And the Europeans should understand that the world is looking at them much more than they believe.
Of course, Europe's looking inwards because of the Eurozone crisis. But
exactly.
Jean-Joseph, I do want to ask you, though, about this triangle, specifically in your book, as you call it, Chindi Africa.
Chindi Africa.
It's a triangle which, according to IMF figures this year, is going to represent 70% of global growth, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, and if you look at the last 4 years, China, India, and Africa contribution to the world growth is about 80%. 80.
We're very far away, though, aren't we, from any kind of geopolitical alliance between these three? Because actually, if you look at Africa, China and India are competing against each other for influence in Africa.
Yeah, but competition is good. Why the Europeans are afraid of competition? The question is not about competition. The question is whether or not this competition is a negative game or is a positive game. Just give you an example. Because or thanks to that competition between China and India in Africa, the Africans are not anymore dependent on the so-called Chinese colonialism. Nobody knows that there are more Indian companies in Africa than Chinese companies. The Chinese are much more visible because they are coming with this prime minister, big delegation. They are talking in billions. But in terms of companies like Tata, Essa, etc., are very active. So they are bringing to Africa the best of the best. Good example. Last week we learned that the combination of Haier and Bharti Telecom got a prize because together they have innovated in the mobile industry in such a way that for the mobile network they can use solar power. And this is the combination, the cooperation between the Indian and the Chinese. So they are competing, but for the best.
But I'm just trying to understand, what is the triangle in that case? If everyone's competing with each other, what is the meaning then of Chindi Africa politically? I'm not quite clear on that.
Politically, you mean?
Yes.
Just go to United Nations and you will see what it means. Today, the African countries, they are 54, but they are very united in the United Nations. And they are working with the Indian and the Chinese. So whenever you have to deal with geopolitical issues, even in the G20, don't forget that South Africa is in the G20. They are representing Africa. You cannot escape from this triangle. They have, for sure, a reason to not to agree on everything. But if you look at the climate change is the best example of how China, India, and Africa are today cooperating for the new world.
There's obviously a huge amount that they can't come together on politically, as you alluded to, and particularly on all these conflicts that the media like to talk about in Africa. African Union, for example, doesn't seem to agree on much. And then when you look at India and China, there's a structural problem between them that is so rooted in their foreign policy, and that is Pakistan. So it's very hard to see them moving beyond certain contingencies and becoming any kind of political alliance. I know you're not saying that there is an alliance at the moment,
There's no
but
alliance.
we can't really expect that to happen in the future, can we?
Well, my own vision is you cannot expect that China, India, Africa will be like the so-called BRICS, tied up, etc. And the reason being that Africa is making the game. People forget about that. It's not China who are making the game. They need Africa much more than Africa need China. Why? Just because China is alone. It's divided. China has no friends in Asia, isn't it? So they need friends. No, they don't have friends. Everybody's scared about China because China is too big. Now, Africa is the maker of the game. And this is very useful for the Europeans to understand because 2 billion inhabitants are living there, or will live there.
Africa is the maker of the game, both for China and for India in many ways.
Yeah.
We'll have to end it there. Thank you very much for your insights, Jean-Joseph Boyau, author with Stanislas Dembinski of Shindy Africa, or Shindy Afrique.
Shindy Africa.
Shindy Africa, which is due to be published in English as well in a few months from now. And do check up other interviews that we've got coming by consulting my Twitter handle, which is @ArmandGeorgian. Thank you very much for watching the interview on France 24.